Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Ragati AA Wash Process Kenya from Weekenders Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Weekenders, based out of Kyoto, Japan. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, with our only other review of their coffee coming when we visited one of their cafes out in Kyoto. And ever since then, I've been wanting to do some full bag reviews of their coffee, as I did have an extremely positive experience with them on that day. So when I found out Airworks was bringing in Weekenders, I was very excited to pick from some of their coffees. And given that one of the coffees I did try when I was out in Japan was one of their Kenyan coffees, and I very much enjoyed it, I also wanted to pick up one of their Kenyan coffees. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 54. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a significantly toned down one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 90 degrees Celsius, about 193 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which usually indicates a more medium fine grind. However, I went a fair bit more coarse on the grind with this one as well. Now, roast profile of this coffee, I was really surprised to see how developed this one turned out to be. As of the coffees that we did review in this golden release, this one actually was the most developed of all of the coffees. The coffees we had from Weekenders in general did feel the most developed of all of the coffees, as I would say that they were pretty close to being on the more medium side of things. You could say maybe on the slightly more light side of that medium, but even then they were surprisingly developed. So for that reason, we will say that this one skews on the more medium side by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 26 through the V60, and the first impression I did have of this coffee was just that it did turn out surprisingly more developed than I was expecting. So the first coffee I started out with was the other coffee that we are reviewing from Weekenders, and that one did turn out a fair bit more developed than I remembered from the coffees I did try out in Kyoto itself. So having this one be as robust and developed as it was kind of just really surprising, as it did seem to hinder the overall presentation of this coffee. Outside of that, there was some slight generic citric brightness to it, but for the most part, it was a little bit more harsh than I was expecting, so I certainly wasn't sure what to make of it. That experience that I did have out in Kyoto was just somewhat of an anomaly in hindsight, because that Ethiopian coffee that we did review on that day was relatively lighter than the majority of the other coffees we had reviewed while we were out in Japan. And in addition to that, I mentioned that I had an opportunity to try a Kenyan coffee on that day as well, and that one also turned out a fair bit lighter than the coffees that we're reviewing from them. So I really don't know what happened, if this is more in line with the way that they actually roast, or if things have changed since that review, but I was just really taken aback by the way that this coffee was presenting itself. Day 29 through the Chemex, and the coffee is still radiating a lot of the more roasty and developed qualities to it, as it's just really robust. There was surprisingly a more faint bit of the Kenyan presentation buried underneath a heaviness to it, but for the most part, the roasty and smoky qualities did seem to really dominate this experience once again, so much so that it was just notably more so than any of the other coffees that we were reviewing in this series, as even the other coffees, not necessarily the lightest, this one did seem to just make those seem even less, I would say, less developed compared to this one. Day 32 through the Ofo brewer, and there's more struggles to this one, as it feels like it might benefit greatly from toning it down, as the experience still continues to remain very robust and smoky, to the point where it's just dominating the overall experience. A slight generic bright Kenyan quality to it, but there's very little outside of that. I wasn't even able to get a lot of the more, we'll say, berry qualities to it, a lot of the more floral qualities to it. For me, it was just pretty heavily one note in terms of that roasty and smoky characteristic, with a faint brightness buried underneath all that. Day 35 through the V60 with Weekenders recipe, which is a 16.67:1 at 93 Celsius, and the coffee was still heavily hindered by the overall roastiness to it, as it did only partially tone down some of that, but for the most part there was a slight bitter sweetness, as it does have a very slight cherry fruit chew feel to it, but it's still offering a very strong roastiness to it once again. So really wasn't entirely sure what to make of it. I said, even with these adjustments, it hasn't really seemed to help this coffee, so we'll just need to continue working on it. On day 38, we opted for the Chemex, and there's a little change as the coffee actually had a slight vegetal celery feel off brew before transitioning into more of that smoky and roasty quality to it. Savoriness presenting in a slight black tea-like sense with a strong, bright, tart berry quality to it. So once again, still continuing to struggle with this coffee regardless of recipe or brew method. So on day 41, we went back through the V60 with an even lower extraction adjustment, so 90 degrees Celsius and an even more coarse grind. And the coffee is only slightly improved, as even toning this one down, it didn't necessarily seem to help, as it honestly felt like the coffee might be falling off with time in general, as there's a little bit less intensity to it overall. The strong Kenyan qualities are there, but they're definitely buried underneath the very robust and heavy qualities of this one. So I think it's worth keeping in context that we did receive all three of these coffees around the same time frame. I want to say close to the day 20 mark or so. And I decided to start the Solcott and the Yoshihara coffees largely because I had experience with Weekenders, and I had assumed that Weekenders was going to be the lightest of them, and we were probably going to be able to wait a little longer with them. That's why we started on day 26. But given the experience that we've had at this point, it just seemed like this one was starting to finally taper off a little bit, even to the point where it just toned down a little bit of the smoky and roasty intensity that had also been there in some of the earlier days. Day 44, do the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this actually felt like it might be the best the coffee had been to this point, as it did seem to tone down a little bit more of the heavy, robust qualities to it, but there's still plenty of that with a slight savory tomato-like quality to it, and also a savory tea-like quality to it, with the brightness also relatively subdued for a Kenyan coffee, as there's a red berry quality to it, but again, it's also pretty subdued. So I do have to say that if anything, I was happy to see the tomato characteristic, largely because it did give this coffee some additional depth. As of this moment, it just seemed to be lacking anything outside of those very intense, robust, and smoky qualities. Day 47, final notes we have through the V60 one more time, and the struggles have continued, as it does continue to remain pretty smoky, pretty robust, with a lot of the roasty qualities just hindering the overall definition to this. A slight bright fruit aspect is toned down as it continues to have the very slight Kenyan characteristics with a little bit more of that vegetal celery-like feel to it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And this is a very unusual looking tasting wheel, but let's go through it. We will start on the other side of the tasting wheel compared to where we usually start these tasting wheels. Savoriness, level 4. And the savoriness comes in a number of ways, and that's why it's definitely worth highlighting. So between the tomato characteristic, the black tea characteristic, and also that celery-like characteristic to it, the most abundant quality I was getting outside of the more developed roasty qualities was the savory qualities to this one. And that's why, very surprisingly, that did score pretty high there at that level 4 mark, as it was the most intense and pronounced characteristic within this coffee for me. So level 4 where we opted to put it. Let's go ahead and move on to the body, also there at level 4. Plenty of body to this one as well. It is a Kenyan coffee, so in theory you are expecting it to have that more juicy body, but this one even then went a little bit above that, as usually the vast majority of Kenyan coffees I'm scoring there at the level 3 mark, but this one had even more body to it, and I think that might be a result of the development of this one being a little bit more heavy, so level 4 where we opted to put that. Next thing, we have the finish at a level 4, and I usually combine that with the acidity when it comes to Kenyan coffees, but that's going to be an entirely different subject. The finish in this one isn't necessarily the brightness of it, it's those very long-lasting smoky qualities to it, and that's not necessarily ideal, so level 4 where we opted to put that. Now let's go through the level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness, level 3. Best thing I had from this entire coffee was that very slight cherry fruit chew-like characteristic I was able to get on some days, so level 3 where we opted to put that. Acidity level 3, I've said before, if the acidity for a Kenyan coffee isn't scoring minimum level 4, then something went horribly wrong, and I can't help but shake the feeling that something went horribly wrong within this coffee, because I can't really explain why the brightness was as subdued as it was for this coffee, and why a lot of the other characteristics of it were as robust, smoky, and intense as they were, but level 3s where we opted to put that, not the brightest Kenyan coffee we've had. In fact, quite the opposite, one of the least bright washed Kenyan coffees that we've ever reviewed. Let's go ahead and move on. Florality, level 3. I can see a little bit of those red qualities to this one. They are there, buried underneath those more intense, robust, smoky qualities. So level 3 where we opted to put that, I can see a little bit of that hibiscus, a little bit of that rose-like characteristic. Spice, level 3, it does have a little bit of that spiced black tea, that savory spiced black tea characteristic to it as well. So level 3 is where we opted to put that. Berry fruit, level 3. And same thing with the brightness. It's always pretty surprising when a Kenyan coffee doesn't score minimum level 4 for that. But the berry fruit qualities in this one were also very subdued. So level 3 is where we opted to put that. You get traces of it. And I would say as far as the fruit qualities go, that was the most abundant of them. Citrus fruit, level 3. I do believe that they have an orange note listed on here. And I feel like it'd be a little bit of a stretch to say that I could see something as defined as that, given that a lot of the qualities within this one weren't particularly well defined. So level 3 where we opted to put that, a little bit more of a generic citric quality if anything. Stone fruit level 3, I can see a little bit more of those darker stone fruit qualities, so I can see some very slight plums, but once again, it still isn't necessarily the most defined within this one, so it's a bit more of a generic stone fruit quality that's presented within it. Chocolate level 3, definitely more of the heavier dark chocolate aspects to it. I mentioned at times that it was slightly bitter in that sense and even slightly harsh in that sense too, so that was a little bit of a surprise that was presented within this coffee. Smokiness, well, actually save that for last. Bitterness level 3. To my surprise, that is also the coffee bitterness. As people that say coffee is bitter, it's usually because the coffee is just a very dark roast coffee and it has that slight coffee bitterness to it. But that was kind of what happened within this one. It had that more traditional coffee bitterness to it. So level 3 where we opted to put that. And then the final thing worth discussing, smokiness level 3. I say it's extremely rare that we review many coffees that have the smokiness that high. And if anything, it could probably go a little higher. It could probably be at that level 4. I think on some of the earlier days when we were keeping it at our standard recipe, it was right up there. It was one of the more smoky coffees we've reviewed in a very long time. So level 4 is where we could have put that, but we kept it there at the level 3 mark, still higher side of level 3 when you take it in comparison to the vast majority of coffees we have. So yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, it's very surprising for a Kenyan coffee, but I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I will put the blame on myself, as I like to do when it comes to a coffee like this, as I really seem to struggle to get the best out of it. So I will say that it was my own fault for not being able to figure this coffee out, as I really did seem to struggle with this coffee. I can't recall too many coffees I've struggled with as much as I seem to struggle with this coffee, and I really don't know what happened with it. As I mentioned going into this, I had an idea of what Weekenders coffees were like based off of the, we'll admit, limited experience that I did have, but even then I didn't expect them to turn out this way. I had heard some people say that these Weekenders coffees were a little bit more developed than they were expecting, but even then I didn't expect it to turn out like this whatsoever. So for that reason, it's really not surprising that this coffee went a lot further than I was expecting going into it. And it probably doesn't help that I had such positive experiences with Weekenders before, so I went into this one with some extremely high expectations. And given that this Kenyan turned out the way that it did, I can only blame myself and say I just don't know what happened, but this was my experience, and I just have to be genuine and honest with the experience that I did have from this coffee. I really don't know what to make of it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I definitely have to start with the profile of this one. I don't know if mine is an anomaly or if this batch is an anomaly or Weekenders just decided to head in this direction instead, but you do have to keep the profile of this specific coffee in mind based off of this experience, and that's to say that it is definitely on the more developed side of things, definitely on the more traditional side of things, as this one did strip away a lot of the qualities that Kenyan coffees do offer. It wasn't necessarily the most bright, it wasn't necessarily the most berry forward, and as a result, a lot of the qualities that were presented within this one are much more traditional coffee qualities. So a little bit more body to it. I would say a little bit more of those smoky, roasty, intense qualities to it, all while keeping the fruits and florals at a more toned down sense. So in a lot of ways, this is what I imagine a very developed Kenyan coffee enjoyer would like, as it still has those Kenyan characteristics of that slight savory quality to it, while at the same time still offering a little bit less of those fruit and floral qualities. So that's honestly kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Ragati AA wash processed Kenya from Weekenders Coffee. Thanks for watching.